December 1944. The Ardennes. Snow falls quietly over the forest near Bastogne, soft enough to hide the sound of tanks beneath the trees. A squad of German infantrymen huddle around a small campfire, warming frozen hands while watching the horizon for signs of movement. One of them, a veteran sergeant named Otto Muller, reaches into his pack and pulls out a small metal box, a captured American field radio. The men laugh. "A toy," Otto says, turning it over in his hands. "Look at this thing. Thin, flimsy, no range. Typical American junk." The others join in, joking that the Americans must use it to call for coffee. Then, as the wind shifts, they hear something that makes them all go silent. From somewhere across the valley, through the same static-filled air, where their own radios usually fail, come sharp, clear bursts of English. Distinct, calm, immediate. "Charlie 6, move up. Artillery ready. Copy your position." Then, seconds later, the thunder of shells. Explosions roll through the forest like a drumbeat. Otto stares at the device in his hand, eyes narrowing. They're not guessing, he thinks. They're talking in real time. For most of the German army, war was a game of patience and precision. Orders arrived by courier or over field telephones that required reels of cable and hours of setup. In theory, it worked. On a quiet front, a battalion could coordinate its artillery, armor, and infantry like a machine. But the moment something went wrong, when shells cut the wires, when runners were captured, when tanks moved too fast for headquarters to follow, the entire machine stopped. A platoon might fight for hours without knowing where its neighbors were. The Americans, though, seemed to move differently. Fast, flexible, unpredictable. Entire units shifting direction, mid-battle. Tanks and infantry moving as if they shared one mind. German intelligence officers couldn't understand it. Reports described unusual coordination and impossible reaction times. Some commanders blamed luck. Others whispered about hidden cables, secret signals, or even coded flares. The truth was smaller, simpler, and far more revolutionary. It fit in the palm of a soldier's hand. In 1941, while the Wehrmacht dominated Europe with blitzkrieg and precision, the United States Army Signal Corps was quietly experimenting with something unheard of in battlefield doctrine: portable, short-range FM radios. Until then, every army in the world used AM, amplitude modulation, for military communication. It was the same technology used by civilian broadcasters and amateur operators. It worked over long distances, but came with a fatal flaw: interference. Thunderstorms, static, terrain, anything could garble a message. FM frequency modulation was the opposite. Shorter range, but cleaner, clearer, more reliable. German engineers had dismissed it as civilian nonsense, useful for music, not war, but in a basement lab in New Jersey. Engineers at Galvin Manufacturing, later known as Motorola, had built something no one else had: a 35-pound backpack radio that could transmit crystal clear voice messages for miles, even through trees, smoke, and chaos. Its name was SCR-300. In September 1942, when the first units landed in North Africa, German signal intelligence intercepted unusual radio chatter. They noted shorter frequencies, rapid switching, and strange clarity. Field officers assumed it was some new Allied code system. No one realized they were hearing the first whispers of a communications revolution. North Africa was the first battlefield where radios decided the outcome as much as bullets did. For the Afrika Korps, communication meant cables stretched across sand and dust, fragile lines that broke under tank treads or wind-blown dunes. When Rommel's forces advanced, they often outran their own signals network. Orders from headquarters could take hours to reach the front. American units, on the other hand, talked freely across miles of open desert. Sherman tank commanders could speak directly to infantry platoons, artillery observers, and air support all through lightweight FM sets. In one engagement near Kasserine Pass, a German officer later wrote that American movements were chaotic, undisciplined, and unpredictable. What he didn't understand was that the chaos was coordination, invisible and instant. While German tanks halted, waiting for field orders, American units maneuvered dynamically, An artillery lieutenant could call in fire from miles away, adjust within seconds, and shift targets faster than German observers could write reports. When Rommel reviewed after-action reports from his surviving officers, he noted one consistent pattern. The enemy reacts faster than we can. The frontline soldiers noticed first. German infantrymen often joked that American troops must be guided by aircraft, that they couldn't possibly move with such precision on their own. But captured American radios told a different story. The SCR-536, the handie-talkie, looked ridiculous to German eyes. It weighed only 5 pounds, had a short antenna, and could fit in a coat pocket. Compared to the massive torn.fu.d, 2 sets carried by German operators, which required 2 men and a backpack battery, it seemed like a child's toy. But its simplicity was its genius. A single American corporal could talk directly to his platoon leader, call for mortar support, or relay a warning instantly, all while under fire in the German army. That same message would require a runner, a written slip, and a chain of command. It could take 20 minutes. By then, the fight might be over. By late 1943, the intelligence section of the German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, began taking notice. Reports from Italy described lightweight American radio devices capable of local coordination at the platoon level. Commanders demanded copies. Captured radios were sent to Berlin for analysis. German engineers examined them with disbelief. The materials looked cheap. The wiring was crude compared to German precision sets, but the signal, when tested, was perfect. A colonel in the Wehrmacht Signals Corps summarized it in one line: "The Americans have made communication idiot-proof." That was the point. American doctrine prioritized function over form, reliability over elegance. Where German designs were built for specialists, the U.S. Army built for ordinary soldiers. Any GI could be trained in an hour to operate a handie-talkie. If it broke, he replaced it. If the battery died, he found another. The simplicity infuriated German officers who believed technology should serve hierarchy. American radios were democratic. Anyone could speak, anyone could lead. And that, on the battlefield, was terrifying. In early 1944, as Allied forces prepared for Operation Overlord, radio communication had become the bloodstream of the U.S. military. Each infantry company carried multiple handheld sets. Each armored division operated on layered frequencies: command, logistics, artillery, air support, all interconnected but decentralized. The result was an army that could think on its feet. At the Signal Corps training centers, instructors drilled one mantra into every recruit's mind: the faster you talk, the fewer die. It wasn't poetry, it was arithmetic. Faster communication meant faster decisions, fewer mistakes, fewer ambushes. Across the Atlantic, German doctrine still emphasized centralized command. Orders came from the top. Initiative was limited. Radio operators were specialists, not soldiers. The few who carried portable sets guarded them like relics. The gap between those two systems wasn't measured in miles or frequencies. It was measured in time. The seconds between hearing an order and acting on it in time, by 1944, had become the difference between survival and annihilation. Back in the Ardennes, Otto Muller and his squad crouched behind a ruined stone wall, waiting for counterorders that never came. The field phones were dead. The wires had been cut hours ago by artillery fire. They tried signaling neighboring units with flares, but smoke from burning tanks choked the sky. Otto looked again at the captured radio, unsure whether to laugh or curse. Then, faintly through the snow, came another American transmission. Bravo 1 flank left. Fire mission approved. Go now. Seconds later, shells erupted behind them, precise, adjusted, unrelenting. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that the Americans weren't guessing at all. They were listening, moving, reacting instantly. It wasn't luck, it was communication. The war he had trained for, the slow, methodical one of orders and delays, was over. This was a new kind of warfare, and his army, for all its steel and discipline, was fighting blind. In 1941, when the United States entered the war, few in Germany took its military seriously. American tanks were considered crude. Their aircraft, underpowered, their soldiers inexperienced. But what the Germans failed to see was that America's strength wasn't in tradition or discipline, it was in reinvention. The same country that mass-produced automobiles and telephones was about to apply that same industrial genius to the battlefield, while the Wehrmacht invested its brilliance in tanks, artillery, and rockets. The U.S. Signal Corps focused on something smaller, the invisible threads that tied everything together. To fight a modern war, they believed, you didn't just need better weapons, you needed better ears. In the laboratories of Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, engineers and soldiers worked side by side, developing portable radios that could withstand heat, mud, salt water, and the clumsy hands of exhausted men. Their goal wasn't perfection, it was communication that simply worked. Anywhere, by contrast, Germany's Signals Command still operated as it had in the First World War. Field telephones connected by miles of copper wire, high-frequency radio sets the size of desks, powered by generators that groaned like tractors. Every message had to travel through a hierarchy of clearance. Even short-distance coordination depended on runners, young soldiers darting between foxholes under artillery fire, carrying written orders that were often obsolete by the time they arrived on Berlin. The Signals Ministry dismissed reports of American lightweight frequency devices as propaganda. One internal memo from 1943 labeled captured -300 Seychelles rupees radios as primitive, civilian sets unsuitable for coordinated military use. The irony would come later. Those primitive devices would soon allow entire American divisions to move like a single living organism. In the deserts of North Africa, the difference became lethal. Rommel's Africa Corps entered the campaign with confidence. They had superior tanks, veteran crews, and battle-hardened officers. But what they lacked, and what they couldn't see, was the ability to adapt instantly. The Americans, green and untested, made mistakes early on. At Kasserine Pass, German tanks smashed through disorganized American lines. Rommel's men laughed at the confusion, at the chaos of retreat. But in that chaos, something new was happening. American officers, realizing that wire-based communications were useless in the shifting desert, turned to their radios. For the first time, platoon leaders spoke directly to tank crews, artillery observers, and even aircraft overhead. What had been static fragments of an army began to connect. One signal at a time. When the dust settled, the Americans learned fast. By the time of the battle at El Gitter in March 1943, they were no longer the same army. Their communications were sharper, faster, and deadly precise. Artillery batteries could change fire missions in under 30 seconds, a task that took German crews several minutes. U.S. tank destroyers coordinated with infantry without ever stopping to lay new wire. Rommel, the Desert Fox, noted bitterly in his diary that enemy coordination has improved to an astonishing degree. They seem to have eyes everywhere. He was partly right. Those eyes were radios behind the front lines. Signal Corps engineers refined their machines under fire. Sand and heat killed early models. Antennas broke. Batteries leaked. But the lessons learned in North Africa became the blueprint for Europe. By mid-1943, every U.S. infantry battalion carried multiple -300 Seychelles rupees backpack sets, while tank units had the smaller SCR 508s installed directly inside their vehicles. The Americans had found their rhythm. Not through technology alone, but through how they used it. While German signals doctrine emphasized control, American doctrine emphasized initiative. If a captain couldn't reach headquarters, he acted. If a sergeant saw an opportunity, he called it in. This philosophy, combined with instant communication, made us forces unpredictable, and that unpredictability was deadly. In Italy, the difference between delay and decision often determined survival. The mountainous terrain turned warfare into a nightmare of broken communication. Valleys swallowed signals. Lines were constantly severed. The Germans, relying on field telephones and radio trucks positioned miles behind the front, struggled to coordinate even short attacks. But the Americans, hauling their SCR 300s over ridge lines and through olive groves, maintained constant contact. Units pinned down by machine gun fire could call artillery within moments. Pilots flying P-47 Thunderbolts could talk directly to soldiers on the ground, adjusting strafing runs in real time. To German observers, it looked like chaos. To those inside the network, it was precision disguised as disorder. At Anzio, a German forward observer wrote in his journal, "We fire, they disappear. We shift position, and their guns follow us. Either they have an all-seeing command, or every man is a commander." He wasn't wrong. Every man did have a voice. Back in Germany, the Wehrmacht's signals command finally realized the scale of their disadvantage. Reports from the Italian and Eastern fronts described a new kind of Allied warfare, one defined by synchronization that seemed impossible under constant bombardment. Captured equipment was studied. In secret facilities near Kassel, engineers disassembled American radios and discovered something shocking: simplicity, where German devices required multiple tuning dials in separate power units. The American sets used pre-calibrated frequencies. Where German field radios needed hours to set up, Americans simply flipped a switch. German engineers were appalled. This was not the precision they prided themselves on. It was crude, inelegant, and utterly brilliant. By the time orders were given to develop a German equivalent, it was too late. The factories that could have built them were under nightly attack from the same Air Force that was now coordinating its raids through radio networks far superior to anything Germany possessed. For frontline soldiers, the impact was psychological as much as tactical. A captured German corporal, interrogated in late 1943, told his American guards that he couldn't understand how U.S. troops always knew where to move. "We fire at one flank," he said, "and within minutes they are behind us. We hit their tanks, and more appear from nowhere. It's as if they hear our thoughts." In reality, what they were hearing were their own words, intercepted, translated, and shared across American radio nets within minutes. The Americans didn't just communicate faster, they listened faster. Signal intercept units attached to Allied divisions monitored German frequencies day and night, feeding live intelligence back to the front. By 1944, the U.S. Army wasn't just fighting with guns, it was fighting with information. At the same time, the radios themselves evolved. The SER-300s, clear voice transmission, revolutionized command structure. Commanders no longer had to rely on written maps or messengers. They could see the battlefield through their soldiers' eyes. The infantrymen, who once felt isolated on the front line, now had a direct line to power. A voice that could call down artillery, summon armor, or request airstrikes. It changed how men thought about war. They weren't just following orders. They were part of a network. For the Germans, this concept was alien. Their army operated like a chain, strong, rigid, but easily broken. The Americans operated like a web, flexible, resilient, impossible to cut completely. By early 1944, Allied intelligence estimated that over 100,000 portable FM radios were active across the European theater. They connected infantry to tanks, tanks to artillery, artillery to aircraft, and aircraft to ships. A single battalion could now coordinate more firepower than an entire division in 1940, and yet, most German officers still refused to believe that technology, not bravery, not numbers, was the key. One report from a captured German major after the fall of Monte Cassino read, "They are not stronger, they are faster. Before we move, they already know. Before we speak, they answer." What he didn't know was that speed was the entire point. The Americans had built a system designed for chaos, and chaos was what Germany's meticulously planned. Army could not survive as spring turned to summer, and the invasion of France drew near. The U.S. Signal Corps refined its coordination to a science. They built radio networks stretching from England to Normandy, hundreds of frequencies layered across command levels. Paratroopers jumping on D-Day carried miniature radios. Tanks on landing craft were already talking to naval artillery before they hit the beach. German defenders, listening through their old sets, heard nothing but static. When they cut the telephone lines along the coast, expecting to cripple Allied communication, nothing happened. The Americans didn't need wires. At Omaha Beach, under withering fire, small groups of U.S. soldiers regrouped not through shouted orders or flares, but through the calm, crackling voices in their helmets. Across the chaos, platoon leaders relayed positions, called air support, and even coordinated evacuations. A German officer watching from the cliffs later wrote, "We destroyed their lines, their bridges, their roads, but they never stopped talking." By the time the smoke cleared over Normandy, it was clear that the old world of warfare had ended. The age of armored columns and fixed communications was over. Germany still believed wars were won with tanks. America had realized they were won with connection. For Otto Muller and thousands like him, that realization came too late. In the forests of France and Belgium, they fought an enemy that seemed to move faster than thought. Orders that once took hours now took seconds. Every delay, every silence, cost lives. What had begun as laughter around a campfire, mocking a toy radio, had become the sound of an inevitability, because while the Germans perfected machines of destruction, the Americans perfected the one thing that kept those machines moving: the ability to talk, to listen, and to act before the other side could even begin to respond. June 6, 1944. Normandy, the dawn light, had barely touched the French coastline when the first radio message crossed the channel. It wasn't a general order or a speech from headquarters. It was a calm, precise voice from a landing craft approaching Omaha Beach. Thunder 6. Mark coordinates sending in naval fire now. Within seconds, shells from offshore cruisers fell in perfect arcs. The sky erupted. The sea turned white. German artillery batteries hidden for months were silenced in less than 10 minutes. From his bunker on the bluffs, Major Werner Hoffman watched the coastline through smoke-filled binoculars. For weeks, he had prepared for this invasion. He knew every sandbar, every approach path, every gun position. The beach defenses had been reinforced by concrete, steel, and machine guns. They were designed to stop any army on Earth. What they weren't designed to stop was communication faster than thought. By mid-morning, Hoffman's field telephones had gone silent. Artillery crews called for orders, but the lines were dead. The Americans had cut them with precision bombardment. He shouted for a runner. None returned. Then came something strange. Fragments of English chatter, carried by wind, impossibly cleared through the roar of battle. Echo 1, enemy strong point neutralized. Charlie Company, flank left. Move now. Copy. Smoke out. Advancing. He could hear them talking as if they were standing in the same room. His own radio operator, sweating under the weight of his torn .fu set, tried desperately to raise command. Nothing. Static. The German frequencies were jammed by Allied interference. Hoffman slammed his fist against the table and shouted, "How can they talk when we cannot?" No one had an answer. What Hoffman didn't know was that the invasion of Normandy was as much a communications operation as it was a military one. Months before D-Day, the U.S. Signal Corps had quietly built a network of hundreds of radio relays across southern England. Each division assigned to the invasion carried its own frequency plan, carefully separated by unit, function, and location. From the first moment boots hit the sand, the beachhead became a living web of communication. Radios connected platoons to ships, ships to aircraft, and aircraft to command ships offshore. Commanders didn't need maps. They had voices. The Germans, relying on hardwired lines, had prepared for a battle of attrition. The Americans brought a battle of seconds. In the chaos of Omaha, where smoke blinded artillery spotters and the tide drowned vehicles. Small radios made the difference between collapse and victory. A single infantry officer, pinned behind a seawall, could still speak directly to destroyers offshore. "This is Dog Green sector fire on my marker. Repeat on my marker." 5 minutes later, naval shells flattened the German One man with one radio changed the battle. German survivors later said they couldn't comprehend how the Americans seemed to know where every gun was. They assumed spies on the cliffs were signaling the fleet. They never imagined that handheld radios could coordinate naval gunfire in real time. The shock rippled up the German command chain like a tremor. Reports arriving at the 7th Army headquarters near St. Lay described a battlefield that defied logic. Units overrun by invisible coordination. Tank assaults cut off by artillery that adjusted too quickly to be random. Counterattacks shattered before they began. One colonel wrote bitterly, "They are faster than we are human." German field communications officers, the same men who once scoffed at American toy radios, now scrambled to understand how the enemy could react so quickly. They intercepted fragments of Allied chatter, short bursts of English, code words, and numbers, but the pattern was beyond comprehension. They didn't realize they were listening to something the U.S. Army called the command net. Every commander down to platoon level had a frequency. Messages weren't requests, they were conversations. Fire missions approved, positions relayed, wounded evacuated, all without waiting for permission from miles away. For the first time in warfare, a global army fought as one synchronized body in the days after D-Day. As Allied forces pushed inland, the German army tried desperately to restore order, but the same technology that had once made them masters of blitzkrieg now betrayed them. Every armored column relied on radio trucks using long-wave AM frequencies that could be traced and jammed. Allied aircraft homed in on their signals within minutes. Meanwhile, American tank battalions advanced in near silence, using low-power FM radios that barely carried beyond a few miles, too weak for detection, but perfect for communication. A German officer from Panzerlehr Division, captured near St. described his disbelief after seeing American tank crews talk directly to infantry while still on the move. "Our radios were for command," he said. "Theirs were for everyone." That difference, top down versus everyone, was the true revolution. In late June 1944, during the battle for Cherbourg, a captured radio set from an American Sherman tank was brought to German headquarters. The engineers examined it carefully. Compact, simple, modular, where German radios required an entire team of specialists to repair. The American set could be fixed with a screwdriver and spare parts. Carried in a canvas pouch, the officer in charge of the inspection reportedly said, "It looks like it was built by a factory worker, not an engineer." He was right, and that was why it worked. American radios were not handmade masterpieces. They were mass-produced tools. They could be dropped, dented, even riddled with shrapnel and still function. They didn't need trained operators. They needed only soldiers who knew how to speak clearly under fire. To an army built on precision and hierarchy, it was heresy. To an army built on speed and adaptability, it was victory. By July, the German High Command finally recognized what it was facing. Intercepted reports from field officers told the same story across every front. Enemy command reacts instantly. Artillery follows us within seconds. Their infantry moves before our orders reach them. The Americans had achieved something that German doctrine never considered possible: decentralized perfection. In the Wehrmacht, initiative came from above. Orders traveled downward through ranks, delayed by caution and bureaucracy. In the U.S. Army, initiative rose from below. The man on the ground could act, decide, and report within seconds. This philosophy, when powered by real-time communication, turned ordinary soldiers into decision-makers. Was this invisible advantage just tanks or aircraft that crushed the German defenses across France? The human side of it told the same story. Captured German soldiers spoke with disbelief about the calm, clear coordination of American units. They had expected chaos, noise, disarray. Instead, they heard a constant murmur of confidence. American officers didn't shout, they spoke. The radios made them sound everywhere at once. In one interrogation report from July 1944, a German sergeant described the experience. "We heard them talking through their radios, even while we were firing. Every shot they answered. It was as if they had hundreds of eyes watching us. We could not hide. We could not move without being seen." To him, it felt supernatural. To the Americans, it was just another day with a working SCR-300. Back in Germany, propaganda struggled to explain the defeat. Official reports blamed Allied numbers, weather, or treachery. But within the technical branches of the Wehrmacht, the truth was known. One confidential memo from the Signals Department, dated August 1944, read, "The American FM system has rendered our entire doctrine obsolete. Their ability to coordinate infantry, armor, and air support surpasses all known military theory." The document concluded with a single grim sentence: without comparable technology, no amount of courage can win. In September 1944, as the Allies advanced toward the German border, the imbalance only grew. American units refined their communication networks to near perfection. Infantry squads carried SCR 536s for local contact. Platoon leaders used backpack sets for coordination. Battalion commanders monitored multiple channels simultaneously, giving orders and receiving updates in real time. Even as front lines stretched and terrain changed, their network never failed. Radios bridged rivers faster than engineers could build crossings. When bridges were blown, communications didn't break. German divisions, by contrast, disintegrated the moment their wires were cut. Entire regiments lost contact for days. Not knowing where neighboring units were or who was still alive, it wasn't just defeat, it was disconnection. By the time of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the difference was absolute. The German offensive began under cover of fog, surprise, and deception. For a few days, their old mastery of stealth and speed seemed to return. But the weather changed, and with it came the radios. American units, trapped in snow-covered forests, used handheld sets to call in airstrikes through gaps in the clouds. Pilots coordinated with ground troops directly, guiding bombs within yards of their own positions. German soldiers, freezing in their foxholes, could only listen in disbelief to English voices calling death from the sky. Even when cut off, American paratroopers at Bastogne kept fighting because their radios still worked. They requested supplies by air, reported enemy movements, and refused to surrender. When the Germans surrounded the town and demanded their capitulation, the Americans replied with one word: nuts, then radioed for ammunition. Within hours, C-47s appeared overhead. To the Germans watching, it felt impossible. How could a besieged unit still talk to the outside world? The answer was strapped to the back of every radio operator. For German soldiers like Otto Muller, who had once laughed at the small American devices, the lesson came too late. By the winter of 1945, every front told the same story. Confusion, delay, collapse. Officers issued orders that never reached the men. Columns moved blind through fog, running into ambush after ambush. Meanwhile, the Americans seemed to flow around them like water. Every movement coordinated, every decision shared. Their radios didn't just send words. They sent certainty in the final days of the war. As German units surrendered across the Rhineland, many laid down not only their weapons, but their disbelief. A communications officer from the 352nd Infantry Division handed over his field radio to an American soldier and said quietly, "We never knew how far behind we were." The Americans, for their part, hardly noticed the miracle they had built. To them, the radio was just another tool, as ordinary as a rifle or a helmet. But historians would later realize that it was this invisible web of voices, the constant pulse of orders, confirmations, and warnings that made the difference between chaos and control. The Germans had learned to fight like a machine. The Americans had learned to think like a network. That network, made of thousands of voices across continents, would become the blueprint for modern warfare, the origin of everything, from air-ground coordination to satellite command systems. Decades later, and it all began with soldiers who carried a little metal box into battle, a box their enemies once called a toy. When the war finally began to crumble in the spring of 1945, it wasn't the roar of tanks or the scream of dive bombers that broke Germany's will. It was silence, a silence so vast and sudden that it seemed to swallow the entire front. For years, German soldiers had lived by the rhythm of shouted orders, by the crackle of field telephones, by the slow, deliberate chain of command that defined their army. Now, in the chaos of retreat, the wires were gone, the radios dead, the voices of command extinguished. The American voices, though, were everywhere, clear, disciplined, relentless. Even as bridges collapsed and towns burned, their communication lines never broke. Artillery still struck with precision. Infantry still moved with purpose. And across the battered cities of the Reich, captured German officers began to understand what they had truly been fighting against. It wasn't just an enemy with more men or more guns. It was an enemy that could think together. In the last weeks before Germany's surrender, American Signal Corps units followed every division, stringing wire, setting up relay towers, building what would become the most advanced battlefield communications system ever seen. From the beaches of Normandy to the Elbe River, they had maintained constant radio contact, a seamless net that stretched over 800 miles of war-torn Europe. Every major U.S. advance, Patton's dash across France, the crossing of the Rhine, the encirclement of the Ruhr depended on it. When tanks stalled or ran low on fuel, a single radio message brought trucks within hours. When bridges were blown, engineers were summoned before commanders even knew the damage. When infantry broke through, artillery knew instantly to the Germans, who still relied on couriers and disconnected command posts. It looked supernatural. Armies simply did not move that fast. In early April 1945, as the remnants of the Wehrmacht retreated through shattered villages along the Weser River, one German communications officer recorded in his diary, "We are deaf. Every line destroyed. Every signal jammed. We are fighting in the dark while the enemy sees everything." He had once been among those who mocked the small American sets as childish machines. Now he wrote, "They do not fight with men alone. They fight with their voices." That diary, later found by Allied intelligence, summed up the collapse of an entire philosophy of warfare. For a century, German command had prized order, precision, and control. But war in the 20th century no longer rewarded the slow perfection of hierarchy. It rewarded speed and the ability to decide before the other side could think. The radio was not just a device. It was a revolution in time. When the first German units surrendered to American forces in April, many officers asked to see the equipment that had defeated them. They wanted to touch it, to understand how something so small could have undone everything they had built. At one makeshift POW camp near Kassel, a group of captured signal operators was shown an American Jeep mounted with an SCR 508 tank radio. They gathered around it in disbelief. The device was no bigger than a loaf of bread. Its dials were simple, its casing dented and dirty. One of the Germans asked the American sergeant if he could hear his commander right now. The sergeant smiled, turned a knob, and within seconds, a clear voice came through. "All units, maintain position. Supply column approaching." The German prisoners stared in silence. In their entire service, they had never heard a command so fast, so direct, so alive. One of them whispered, almost to himself, "That is how we lost." In the months that followed, as thousands of German soldiers were transported to POW games across America, the shock of defeat slowly turned to fascination. Many of them were assigned to work on American farms or in factories, where they saw the same philosophy everywhere, the same idea that made the radios work: efficiency through simplicity, power through connection. They noticed that American machines were not perfect. They were practical. Tractors that rattled but ran all day. Tools that any man could use. Radios that any soldier could fix. It was a reflection of the same spirit that had filled the American army. An unpretentious confidence in ordinary people solving extraordinary problems. For German engineers raised to worship precision, it was a humbling revelation. In interviews, years later, many former German officers admitted that they had underestimated what they called the American system. They had assumed democracy produced disorder, that freedom created weakness, that soldiers who could speak freely would lack discipline. Instead, they found the opposite. The very freedom that allowed a private to talk to his lieutenant without fear also allowed armies to adapt faster than any hierarchy could command. The radio was more than a weapon. It was the voice of that freedom, turned into a tactical advantage. After the war, the lesson spread quietly through military academies and research institutions. Engineers studied captured American radios, not for their components, but for their philosophy. The key wasn't the circuits. It was the concept of real-time communication between equals. In 1947, a former German electronics officer wrote in a technical journal, "We lost, not because their radios were stronger, but because their minds were freer." The line became famous among historians. It captured something larger than technology, the idea that communication itself could be a weapon of ideology. For the Americans who had built and carried those radios, The end of the war brought little glory. The signal corps returned home quietly, without parades or medals. Their work had been invisible, their victories unheard. Yet every tank that advanced, every bomber that struck, every soldier who lived to see another dawn owed something to that invisible thread of sound. In the decades that followed, the same engineers who had designed the -300 Seychelles rupees began work on peacetime communications. The principles of mobile FM radio became the foundation for police systems, emergency networks, and eventually, the cellular technology that would connect the modern world. The voice that once guided soldiers through battle would, in time, guide humanity into the age of information. Historians often call World War II the war of industry, the war of factories and machines. But for those who lived it, it was also the war of connection. For the Germans, it ended in silence. For the Americans, it ended in signal. From the deserts of Tunisia to the forests of the Ardennes, every victory traced back to a single moment, a soldier pressing a button and saying, "Copy, moving now." It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, but it changed history. Because when words move faster than bullets, the side that speaks first wins. Decades later, a surviving German radio operator from the 21st Panzer Division visited the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. He stood before a display case containing a single olive green -300 Seychelles rupees backpack. His hands trembled as he leaned closer. "It is smaller than I remember," he said quietly, "and yet it spoke louder than our entire army." He paused, then smiled faintly. "We thought we were the masters of order, but they were the masters of time." For modern soldiers, the idea of real-time communication is taken for granted. Satellites, digital networks, encrypted links, all descendants of those first crackling FM signals that leaped across the fields of France. But behind every modern command lies that same human truth. The faster we share what we see, the more we survive. The radio turned war from a sequence of plans into a living conversation. It allowed ordinary men to act with extraordinary coordination. It gave an army of individuals a single heartbeat. The Germans had entered the war believing discipline was their greatest strength. They ended it learning that adaptability was stronger. Still, in the years after 1945, as West Germany rebuilt under Allied supervision, many of its new military advisors, men who had once fought the Americans, quietly adopted the same principles they had once mocked. Decentralized command, rapid communication, real-time coordination. By the 1950s, the newly formed Bundeswehr trained its signal officers using manuals translated from U.S. Army doctrine. The very system that had defeated them became the foundation of their defense in the Cold War. Ironically, the tool that once symbolized their humiliation became their protection, the connection that would keep peace through the next generation. The story of the American radios is rarely told in war movies or textbooks. There are no heroic charges, no medals for valor, no famous generals standing beside transmitters. But the truth remains, without those small boxes, the great battles of Europe might have ended differently. The radio didn't just carry words, it carried trust. Trust that the man speaking would be heard. Trust that the man listening would act out. That trust multiplied across 1 million soldiers became the most powerful weapon in the world. When the war was finally over, and Europe fell silent, one could almost imagine the echo of those voices fading into history. Thousands of young men, strangers to one another, connected by a sound that cut through chaos. They didn't know it then, but they were building the architecture of the modern world, one signal at a time.